and everybody loves a good conspiracy theory. And as we know, the mother of all conspiracy theories is the assassination of John F. Kennedy in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, 1963. People still talk about it to this day. I mean, there are other things in the world that overshadow it, and maybe it's not talked about as much as it was before, but people still wonder about it. So today's your lucky day, because I'm going to give you the truth behind that assassination. No one ever told you the truth before, but you're going to hear it right now. Now, I try to shy away from talking to other people about this subject, because when I do, they always tell me, oh, I saw this show on the History Channel. Or they say, oh, I read an article in the newspaper, and they told me about this theory, and oh my gosh, now I got it all figured out. Lyndon Johnson killed JFK. I look at him like, yeah, okay, you know all about it. The truth will not be in the major media. They won't allow it to come out. You won't see it on the History Channel, and you won't read it in the Register. The people who committed that assassination are very, very powerful. They're not going to let you know the truth through the major media. That won't happen. So don't tell me that you heard the truth on the History Channel. I'm not going to believe you. If you want to find out who killed John F. Kennedy in Dallas that day, you'd be better off to find out what they don't talk about in the press, what they're trying to cover up. You'd be better off to try to find out the facts that send these people into hissy fits of hysteria. They get all agitated and irritated when you talk about it. These are the facts that will bring the truth out, not the ones you hear about on the History Channel. Those are the facts they put out there to confuse you and to throw you off track. You've got to look for the facts that they hide and the facts that they do not want you to know. Those are the ones you want to find out. Now, there's a basic, simple historical fact relating to the Kennedy assassination that nobody talks about. This basic fact is that in 1963, when Kennedy was assassinated, there was already an assassination team that was established for the purpose of committing presidential assassinations. This team was given the weapons necessary to commit presidential assassinations. They were given the power to commit presidential assassinations, and they were given the power to get away with presidential assassinations. And what I'm talking about is the team that was set up to murder Fidel Castro in the late 1950s and the early 1960s. It was a team made up of members of the Mafia and members of the anti-Castro right-wing CIA. This group was in place and highly trained specifically to commit presidential assassination. Its members included Howard Hunt, Frank Sturgis, and a whole bunch of Cubans. Now, if you've done any research about the Kennedy assassination, you've heard all these names before, because these names are associated with the Kennedy assassination. All these people did was switch their focus. They were supposed to kill Castro, but then they changed their focus and they switched it to Kennedy. And these are the exact same people who shot John Kennedy in Dallas. Now, what people don't know, unless you do some detailed research, is that Jack Ruby, another name associated with the Kennedy assassination, was also involved in this anti-Castro effort. He was working with the CIA and the Mafia in the effort to get Castro. After Fidel Castro took power in Cuba, he threw a bunch of Mafia leaders in prison there. And Jack Ruby was a money man for the Mafia. He used to carry money. And Jack Ruby went to Cuba a bunch of times and carried the money that was used to bribe Cuban officials to get some of these Mafia guys out of prison. And Jack Ruby was big in the anti-Castro effort with the CIA and the Mafia. But of course you won't hear that on the History Channel. They don't want you to connect the dots. It's not part of the story that they want you to know about. And the main character in the Kennedy assassination, namely Lee Harvey Oswald, was also associated with these anti-Castro people. This Mafia, CIA, anti-Castro effort. Lee Oswald was in with them. He worked with them. They were together in the same plot. People don't talk about what Oswald was doing in the summer before Kennedy was shot. in the summer of 1963. Well, I'm going to tell you right now, guess where he was? He was not in Dallas, he was in New Orleans, living and working in New Orleans. And who was he working with there? Just months before Kennedy was killed, Oswald was in New Orleans working with the people who were heading this Mafia CIA anti-Castro plot. There was a guy in New Orleans called Guy Bannister. He used to be an ex-FBI guy, but now he's leading the effort against Castro from New Orleans. Well, Lee Oswald's working side by side with this guy, Guy Bannister. So here we have Lee Oswald working with the assassination team that was supposed to kill Castro. Oswald was part of that team. Jack Ruby was part of that team. But then you could see exactly how they changed their focus from Castro to Kennedy, because all these names that were big in the anti-Castro movement are now big in the Kennedy assassination story. They're all the same people. They're all the same characters. All they did was switch their focus from Castro to Kennedy. They were supposed to kill the one guy, just turned around and killed the other one. That's all they did. Now there's more to this story, and I'm not done yet. I'm going to wrap it all up and tie it all together. And I'm going to tell you the exact truth about what happened to JFK. I'm going to tell you some basic, simple historical facts that will tie it all together and make it all plain. And then you will know the truth about the assassination of JFK. Sit back and enjoy. So now, we already know that John F. Kennedy was assassinated by a group of mafia people working together with rogue CIA agents who were all working together at one point to assassinate Fidel Castro. And they switched their target from Castro to Kennedy, and they ended up killing John Kennedy. But now, here's the rest of the story. This group of Mafia and CIA guys was put together in the late 1950s. And you remember who was president in the late 1950s. It was Dwight Eisenhower. And Dwight Eisenhower's vice president was Richard Nixon, the guy right behind me. See my buddy Richard here? As Dwight Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon was in control of everything having to do with Cuba. And this is all in the history books. It's not just my opinion. Now, it's not hard to imagine how easy it would have been for Richard Nixon to get his good friends in the Mafia and his good friends in the CIA to work together. And this is what he did. He assembled an assassination team consisting of his friends in the Mafia and his friends in the CIA. And this assassination team was supposed to kill Fidel Castro. And they trained for that, and they were given the weapons for that, and they were given the protections to get away with presidential murder. But then they switched their target, and they killed Kennedy. Now, I'm sure you have never heard the link between Richard Nixon and the JFK assassination before. No one ever told you that before, did they? But it's basic historical fact. And the proof of this comes later in history, during the Watergate scandal that occurred in the early 1970s. Now, you remember the Watergate scandal. That's when a group of Nixon's secret operatives, called the Plumbers, broke into the Democratic National Headquarters and stole documents and bugged the telephones. Now, at the time, it was called a third-rate burglary, and that's what it was. But Nixon raised it to a major constitutional crisis. Now, why did Richard Nixon do that? Why did he take a minor criminal offense perpetrated by other people and turn it into a major constitutional crisis that forced him to resign the presidency? Why did he take a minor thing like that and turn it into a major, huge ordeal? That's the question. And no one's ever answered that question. But I'm going to do it for you right now. This is the link between Nixon, Watergate, and the JFK assassination. Now, in the very first days of the Watergate scandal, Richard Nixon was voice recorded in the Oval Office, having conversations with his aides. And he was worried about the scandal, and he kept repeating the same thing over and over again. He said that this Watergate thing all tracks back to the Bay of Pigs. And that's a theme that he said again and again. He said this will open up a lot of scabs, it'll uncover a lot of scandals, and it'll all track back to the Bay of Pigs. Now, what was Richard Nixon talking about, and why was he worried about the Bay of Pigs? When the Bay of Pigs invasion occurred, John Kennedy was president, and Richard Nixon was a private citizen living in California. John Kennedy was president then, so why was Richard Nixon saying that the Watergate scandal all tracks back to the Bay of Pigs, and why was he so worried about that? Well, the person who gives us the answer is Richard Nixon's chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman. And H.R. Haldeman wrote a book about the Watergate scandal called The Ends of Power. On page 24, H.R. Haldeman begins talking about the Kennedy assassination. Now, this is a book that's supposed to be about Watergate. So why is H.R. Haldeman talking about the Kennedy assassination in a book about Watergate? It's because the two things are connected. And this is what Richard Nixon was saying when he talked about how the Watergate break-in all tracked back to the Bay of Pigs thing. Now, the connection is that the Watergate plumbers, the people who broke into the Democratic headquarters to steal the documents and to bug the telephones, are the exact same team that was involved in the Kennedy assassination. It was Howard Hunt, it was Frank Sturgis, and it was a whole bunch of Cubans. The same people that broke into the Watergate headquarters are the same people that assassinated John Kennedy. The Watergate plumbers was actually a team that Nixon was using throughout his entire career. It was the team that Nixon brought together to assassinate Fidel Castro. They switched their target from Castro to Kennedy. And then it was the same team that broke into the Democratic National Headquarters and caused the Watergate scandal. These were Richard Nixon's secret operatives, the Watergate plumbers, the Kennedy assassination people. They're all the same people. Now, you can research this for yourself, but you won't hear it on the History Channel, and you won't read about it in the newspapers or the magazines. Richard Nixon raised Watergate to a major national crisis that brought down the presidency because it was connected to the Kennedy assassination. And he said it himself. He said the Watergate break-in all tracks back to the Bay of Pigs. And H.R. Haldeman tells us that every time Richard Nixon said the Bay of Pigs, it was a code word for the Kennedy assassination. Now, if you remember your history, you remember that just before Richard Nixon resigned, his vice president, Spiro Agnew, was forced to resign. They resigned one after another. First Agnew resigned, and then Richard Nixon resigned. Now, after Spiro Agnew resigned, who did Richard Nixon bring in as the new vice president? He brought in Gerald Ford, a former member of the Warren Commission, which investigated John F. Kennedy's assassination. And Gerald Ford was one of the major players on that commission who kept out all the bad information that they didn't want the public to know about. Gerald Ford was instrumental in covering up the important facts that would have revealed the truth. So just before Nixon resigned, he brought in Gerald Ford to be the vice president, a man who was well versed in the subtle art of covering up the truth about the Kennedy assassination. So now Gerald Ford is vice president. Now that frees up Richard Nixon to resign. Gerald Ford ascends to the presidency, and now the secret is safe. The secret that the Watergate burglary was tied to the Kennedy assassination is safe because now Gerald Ford, a cover-up specialist, is president. And then who did Gerald Ford bring in to head the CIA? He brought in George Bush, the father, not the current president, but he brought in the father, George Bush, president number 41. And together, these two people, Gerald Ford as president, former member of the Warren Commission, and George Bush as head of the CIA, covered up this bad, damaging information about the Kennedy assassination. So there you have it in a nutshell. That's the entire story of the Kennedy assassination. In the late 1950s, Vice President Richard Nixon established an assassination team to kill Fidel Castro. The team was made up of the Mafia and the CIA and anti-Castro Cubans all working together. This anti-Castro assassination team switched their target from Castro to Kennedy. This team killed Kennedy in Dallas. It was a team put together by Richard Nixon. In 1973, after the Watergate scandal broke, Richard Nixon realized that the exact same team that broke into the Democratic headquarters and caused Watergate was the same team that had killed John Kennedy. And Richard Nixon was afraid that that information would come out and reveal the truth behind the Kennedy assassination. So Richard Nixon started a major cover-up of the facts so that the truth about the Kennedy assassination wouldn't come out. Nixon raised the minor Watergate burglary into a major constitutional crisis to hide these facts. When Richard Nixon spoke about it, he spoke in code, but people tell us what he really meant. Richard Nixon was worried that the Watergate break-in would reveal the facts about the Bay of Pigs. Nixon's Chief of Staff, H.R. Halderman, tells us that every time Nixon said the Bay of Pigs, he was really referring to the Kennedy assassination. So Richard Nixon was worried that the truth about the Watergate break-in would reveal the truth about the Kennedy assassination. Just before Richard Nixon resigned, his vice president was forced to resign, and Richard Nixon brought in Gerald Ford, a major Kennedy assassination cover-up artist, to be vice president. When Nixon resigned, Ford ascended to the presidency and completely covered up the truth about not only Watergate, but about the Kennedy assassination. The basic facts are out there, people, but you will not hear them in the major media. And now you know the truth.